Hey guys, today we're going to talk about free body diagrams. It's a pretty important and useful thing in physics. So we'll talk about what they are, what we use them for, how we make them, and I'll show you a few examples of free body diagrams so you know what you're doing on the homework. But before we get to that, we're going to talk about friction. We're going to talk about friction more on another day, but we do need to have at least a brief introduction of it here today. So friction, as you probably know, friction is a force which resists motion or potential motion. So when two objects are sliding past each other, there's going to be friction between those. But you can also have friction if there's just a force trying to make it move, even if they're not actually moving, you can still have friction. So friction is a force that resists motion or potential motion. Now, if two objects are in contact, but there's no force being applied to try to make them move, then there's no friction. The friction only exists when the force is there. And it's always a contact force. You can only have friction between things that are actually touching each other. So there's no friction between my hands right now. There may be friction between my hands and the air because the hands are touching the air, but there's no friction between things that are just close to each other. Now, why does friction exist? This is a useful thing to understand. It's because of very small, tiny variations and irregularities in the surfaces of the objects themselves. So all surfaces are rough to some degree. Even if you have a perfectly flat plane like a cleaved crystal, where all the atoms in the crystal are all split on a single plane, it's still going to look like, when you look at that surface under a very powerful microscope, it's still going to look like a cookie tray full of marbles. It's not going to be a perfectly smooth surface. It's going to be bumpy because the atoms themselves are bumpy. It's like a bucket of tennis balls. So microscopic surfaces are always rough. And when two objects are just sitting by each other, well, they kind of lock together. So there's resistance to you being able to move them. Okay, and even if you are moving them, they kind of bump and scrape along with each other, and that causes resistance to the sliding or to the motion. So friction is caused by variations in surfaces, microscopic variations in surfaces. Now, turns out that friction comes in two flavors. There are two types of friction. The first one we call static friction. And the word static in this sense means not moving. So this is the friction between two objects which have no relative motion. They're not moving relative to each other. Now, I don't know if this shows up on the video here, but we abbreviate static friction as F for friction and with a subscript S. So F sub S is static friction. The other type of friction is called kinetic friction, or sometimes sliding friction. But we call it kinetic friction. Your book calls it kinetic friction. It's because it's represented by F sub K for kinetic. And if we called it sliding friction, they would both be F sub S, and it'd be confusing. So kinetic friction is where there actually is relative motion. So when my hands are stuck together and I'm trying to push them, that's static friction. When they break loose and they start sliding, that's kinetic friction. Now, why do we care about the difference? Because one of them is stronger than the other. Static friction, when the two objects are not moving, that is a stronger force than kinetic friction. The strong one is the static friction. Now, you know this from your own experience. If you've ever tried to slide heavy furniture to rearrange your living room or something like that, and you're pushing on the couch with somebody else, once you get it moving, people say, keep it moving, don't let it stop. If it stops, we won't get it moving again. Because that initial static friction, it's hard to overcome, but once you break it loose, it's easier to keep it going. And as long as you keep it going, the friction is lower until you stop again, and then it locks up and you're back to static friction. Now, why does this happen? Why is static friction stronger than kinetic? Well, again, we have irregularities between the surfaces. So when they're stopped, they kind of settle down and interlock with each other. And when you start trying to push this, you're physically running into the bumps because they're interlocked. And to get this moving, you're either going to have to break off some of the pieces that are blocking you, which will make the surfaces smoother, or you have to kind of rise up so that you start bumping and scraping along the top of this. And then so it's easier to keep it moving along. Now, as soon as you stop, then they settle back together and they interlock again, and the static friction becomes strong. That's the reason. What do you have to know? You have to know that there's two types of friction. You have to be able to identify them by the way we write them. And you have to know that the static friction is stronger than the kinetic friction. Okay, all right, so that brings us to free body diagrams. There we go. So free body diagrams. This is in section 4.6, I believe, of your book. Yes, 4.6. I should write that up here. Section 4.6. There we are. That's nice. Free body diagrams. They are incredibly useful tools in physics. They use them at all levels of physics. This isn't just something for beginners. This is something that Nobel Prize winners use. Very useful and common tool. What it is a way for us to take an inventory of all the forces that are acting on an object or on a system. It's a way for us to visualize what's going on. And write it down in a simple way. Now, we also sometimes call these force diagrams, although free body diagram is the more common term. Now, why do you have to know these? Well, because it's a useful thing, but also because College Board on your AP exam absolutely will ask you to make a free body diagram, and they care about the format that you use. They care about the way you draw the thing and the way you label the thing. There's a right way to do it. And it's a good way to learn it. It's the way that physicists generally do it. There's a standard way to do this. So yeah, free body diagrams are a big deal. You've got to know these. You've got to understand these. You've got to know how to use them. And don't worry, they're pretty simple. They're very intuitive. That's why they're so useful and so common. Okay, so I'm going to just start off here by drawing some free body diagrams and explaining how it is. So first, we're going to make a free body diagram of you sitting on a chair, or of me just sitting on a chair. Let me go to the camera here so we can see this. All right. So first off, we represent the object that we're interested in as just a dot. So this represents you. And you don't even have to label it if you don't want to, unless it's going to be confusing in some way. So a free body diagram, first of all, is not a realistic representation. It's kind of a schematic representation, a simplified one. So this is you sitting on a chair. Now, a free body diagram is an inventory only of the forces that are acting on the object itself. So it's only for a single object. And we call it a free body because this object is a body which is free to move anywhere in responses to the forces acting on it. It's a free body. We make a diagram of the forces. So when you're sitting on the chair, you have weight, and that weight is pulling you down. So we make a force vector which points in the direction of the force, and we label it F sub G because it's the force caused by gravity acting on you, and it is pulling down. Now, you're not falling to the basement because the chair itself is supporting you. So there's also an upward force on you, which is a normal force. You should remember this from the last reading that you did. A normal force, remember, is a force which acts perpendicular to a surface. Let's see, yeah, there it is. A force that acts perpendicular to a surface. And since the chair is level, it's pushing you straight up. And that's it. That's all there are. Now, your book likes you to always summarize this with a net force. So we say F net equals 0 in this case, because your weight pushing you down into the chair is the same as the chair pushing you upward. Now, it is important to keep these approximately accurate, okay? So forces which are equal to each other should be represented by arrows that are about the same length. Likewise, the direction is important. Upward forces need to be pointing up. Downward forces need to be pointing down. Yeah, so the length of the forces have to be accurate relative to each other. If one of these forces is stronger than the other, then you have to make it clear that one of the vectors is longer than the other, so if there's some net force acting. Now, in this case, the forces balance out. The net force is 0, so we write F net equals 0. Now, this thing here, this F net equals 0, this is something that the book wants you to do. This is not normally something that is always put in free body diagrams. So on AP, they may ask you to make a free body diagram of you sitting in a chair. And they will not be expecting you to do the net force. They will usually follow it up with a question that says, and what is the net force acting on you? They'll usually ask it separately. But you have to be able to figure out the net force or approximate the net force based on your diagram. That's the main thing. Okay, so the object you're interested in is the dot, is represented by a dot. And then the individual forces are drawn as force vectors pointing away from the object and labeled. And you can make these labels as detailed as they need to be, but for the context of this question, normal force and weight is just fine. Okay, now let's go back to another one here. How about a free body diagram of the chair with you sitting on it? Okay, free body diagram of the chair with you sitting on it. And if you want to try this, go ahead, but you don't have to. We're going to be doing a few of these where you can practice. So this is going to be the chair. So now the chair is represented by the dot. Okay, now the chair itself has some weight. It doesn't have as much weight as you, presumably. It's a smaller chair. So its weight vector is smaller than yours was because the chair weighs less than you. Okay. But now you're sitting on the chair. So this is the weight of you. And we draw that as a force vector pointing away, downward away from the chair. Even though the force is being applied from above, we always make free body diagrams as forces pointing away from the object itself. That's the convention. Now, if you want to put in FG chair here, that's fine to distinguish that vector, which is the weight of the chair, from this vector, which is the weight of you. Okay, and finally, we have to have the normal force because the chair is sitting on the floor. So this is F sub n, the normal force. And notice that I've tried to make the length of this normal force vector equal to the length of your weight plus the weight of the chair itself. So this plus this is this, as far as the magnitudes go. And the chair is still sitting there. It's not sinking into the floor or flying up toward the ceiling. So F net, again, equals 0. But you got to make this vector a little bit longer to approximate that it is the two short vectors combined. Okay, so that's the free body diagram of the chair with you sitting on it. What else we got? Now I want you to try some.